And good morning, fellas. You Moot Men, and it's as we've already talked about. It's our last session for 2022. Today's December 21st, and we'll break next week, and then in 2 weeks on January 4th we'll get back together and continue. Notice on the screen it says I've got 155B, and I know when you see a B, it's really scary, because you're wondering, God, could there be a C and could there be a D and an E? How many are there letters? But I just want you to understand, at least from my perspective, I think that the gospel writer, John, is bringing his book to a known and planned, a strategic pinnacle. And it's all about his intention in writing this book. I was pondering, and so we're going to dive into this section because I think it's really critical. It's really interesting when you talk about the Gospels and in reading commentaries too. They talk about the synoptics. Synoptic means viewing through the same eyes, and it basically means that Matthew, Mark, and Luke have a same profile or way that they're looking at the gospel accounts, although they each have their nuance, but it's kind of the same approach. And then they say, well, then we have the fourth gospel, which is John. They call it the fourth gospel. And I've been doing this a while here with John, and I have not read yet any really well-defined objective regarding John's gospel. And he had one. Every writer has an objective of what they're trying to do. But I find that very interesting. And it's interesting that when people talk about the four gospels and they talk about the fourth gospel, the general language is, and the fourth gospel, it's kind of an intellectual gospel. And it goes into La La Land. And that's really kind of, I haven't really heard anything more than that. Guys, I'm a retired businessman and electrician. In no way am I saying that I have found the kernel of truth here. But through the reading of the text, from my perspective, and I'm not alone, I think John is actually bringing his audience to the point he wants to bring them so that they understand how to think about Jesus and understand how to think about the death of Jesus on the cross. This is not a side note. This is a core idea of what we are talking about. This is not just a cool thing to think about. This is what I think they are thinking about, and what John, from my perspective, what John is his intent for his first century audience. So we're going to look at this term scapegoating. We introduced it last week. And we're going to look at it. We're going to look at the entire flow of John briefly, to kind of build on this case. We didn't finish our time last week, and we missed one verse 53, and I just wanted to talk about this briefly at the beginning of part B. So from that day on, they planned together to kill him. Again, I think this is a pinnacle, a transitional point. From this point, from verse 53, we start to move towards the passion narrative of Jesus's last week and death and resurrection. And so his book is coming to a climax right here as far as this section, and he's going to move to the next. Now, it's at this point that John identifies within his book that the hammer, this is, I call it the dropping of the hammer drops. Notice there is no talk of the judicial process, a testament, which they had at that time. There was a process. No testimony, no trial, no dialogue. The verdict is the hammer's drop. The verdict is passed. Jesus must die. And all that is left is how to make it happen. This is pretty critical. Now, here is a mouthful. The temple leaders demonstrate at this point the universal human practice of scapegoating. This, I think, is essential to continue. Once the verdict is made, so I kind of define it, once the verdict is made in one's head, and this is not a problem that Caiaphas has alone. This is a human practice, Once the verdict is made within one's head, nothing the accused says or does matters. I don't know if you've seen it. I've seen it. I see it all the time. Once the verdict is passed, nothing the accused says really matters because it's all in one's head. It's at this point that much of what the indicator or the initiator, the one that is in the driver's seat, I think it's unconscious. I think this is a result of the human condition that we're in. And that this is something that we are all participative in. That is a hard thing to say. It's a hard thing to hear. It's not because we're bad people. It's because we're human people. And I think that it goes unconscious. When I feel the pressure coming on me, I naturally point, who can I blame? Who can I point? Who can be the scapegoat? Who can I blame? Yeah, Bill.
This is probably where you enter in that thing of information bias. I mean, everything that supports your position, you absorb, and everything that does it goes off you like water.
Yep. At that point, I flip and I'm calling it, we go into an unconscious, all I want to hear is what supports my position.
Right.
And I think that's exactly right. Yeah, John.
So do you find as you get older, you feel that way less and less?
I feel more and more. I am studying this. And so John, to be quite honest, I'm seeing this everywhere. But that's a natural human thing too. We tend to see what we're looking for.
I think John meant, do you personally feel yourself being less and less tendency to scapegoat?
Yeah, well, because I'm becoming more aware.
Okay.
I am seeing how much I do this, and I've gotten really good at it, and it bothers me. Yeah, I'm becoming more aware of it. Yeah. And it has to do with my own, in my business, in my own relationships with my wife, with my kids. It's just how my head works. And I think it's an evil. I think this is not a side note. This is what John is talking about through Caiaphas. He's not even aware. And it's a tragedy that what we humans do to other humans, both on a large scale and at a micro scale. So, and I think the thing unconscious in the story of the scapegoat, the people had to believe, Leviticus 16, that when the high priest put his hands on the goat and allowed the goat to go in the wilderness, they actually believed that their sin was being carried off. They believed it. And that was the important. If they didn't believe it, then it would have no power. And now we know from the New Testament the New Testament writer to the Hebrews says it's impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sin. But they believed. So it doesn't matter what is real here. It's what they believed. And I think it's in their heads.
Does this get amplified in mob violence or group thing
yes.
that suddenly, if you're standing in front of a mob and you're innocent, you can declare that's irrelevant, you know?
What they'll crucify you.
Bingo. Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think personally, when you're dealing with policemen arresting people, you do have people who are guilty of things and you do have to sentence them. And that's a legal process. This is different.
Yeah, well, here we have, we're going to see a scapegoating process take place, and the victim is totally innocent. It turns the whole thing on its head, and we're actually going to talk about that.
Okay.
This whole thing of the people in their minds, they have to believe it. And I think me personally, I have always looked for justification. Who can I blame when the heat comes on me? And like I said, I've gotten really good at it. And that bothers me. This is true because the initiator actually believes that the removal of the victim. Now, we could use the term sacrifice there. It's not always a sacrifice unto death, but it's a removal. I've got to place it on the victim, and that there has to be a removal. And that through that process, I will experience peace. This is exactly what Caiaphas is saying. And here's the process in a very rudimentary way. Conflict is present. There's a conflict in the context. And that's conflict to us is always undesirable. It always. And it flows out of conflict. Within that conflict, one is blamed and to be removed. Caiaphas speaks from a high priest perspective. He's been involved in this for every year on Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur, Dave? The Day of Atonement. And about the scapegoat, but he had to do it every year. He knew it worked. He knew this worked. And he said, guys, or people, I think they're all guys. He says, don't you know that it is expedient that one man dies for the whole? And in his mind, he had no inkling whether Jesus was guilty or innocent. It made no matter. All he wanted was relief. He wanted Rome to be satisfied so that they would not come in and shut the whole temple process down, and he would lose his job. And so Jesus is identified. Number 3, the removal will be carried out, as we'll read in the gospel account. It's coming. And then as a result, there's always in the back of his mind and in my mind that it'll restore a peace, a harmony. And this is where the death of Christ really gets interesting on this whole idea of looking at Jesus's death on the cross through the lens of a scapegoat structure. Bill, you had a question.
Well, first of all, you're breaking up a little bit, at least listening to you. I'm getting it, but your mic is a little breaking up. But for this one, we know it's 1, but on line number 2, I think you could also insert a group or a category of people.
One is blamed. Oh, yes, it can be an idea. It can be a group. That's exactly right. The basic scapegoat idea is that the one stands for the many. That one may be more than one. Yeah, you're exactly right. Yep. It's something we place the blame on, something carries the blame so I can go free, so I can experience harmony, so I can feel better about myself. So we bracket those four ideas that simplified. This is the scapegoating process that's carried out over and over and over again. And the common truth for us to get at this point, notice it's in highlighted, is that the verdict derived in one's head dictates one's reality. Makes no difference whether Jesus is guilty or innocent. It's this works and this will set me free. Caiaphas is saying, but he has no idea. He is clueless to the bigger picture. And John brings that out. So here is illustrated Caiaphas' frame of reference. Caiaphas lives in a box, like all human beings live in a box of what they know, what we know, and we see everything from inside the box. We think we see more than we really do, but here's what he sees. Caiaphas sees what he sees because that's what he's chosen to see. I mean, that seems kind of silly, but it's really true. He's choosing what he's seeing. In his mind, the scapegoating practice has always worked. He's seen it year after year, but it never works fully. You have to come back and do it over and over. Through the sacrifice of one, we as a people will benefit. In his mind, this is all that really matters. Okay, we're going to let this one go, and everyone will go free. That's his justification. That's how he's thinking. John, the writer, informs the audience that there's a much larger reality which exists, of which is veiled to Caiaphas. He doesn't see it. And he says that right in the text. Here, John introduces the idea that the scapegoating practice is about to take on an entirely different meaning through the person of Jesus. Thus is why I think it's core. It's not just a side note. I think this is core, and he's attempting to help the first century readers understand the death of Christ from his perspective. Here's the text. Caiaphas, who is high priest, said to them, "You know nothing at all." We talked about that. Nor are you taking into account that it is in your people's best interest that one man die for the people, and that the whole nation not perish. Thus, he's referencing Rome's shutdown of the temple. And the temple activities would continue to be allowed. We got to bring peace. We got to restore the peace to appease the Roman rule. Now, he did not say this on his own. John interprets that statement. But as he was high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus was going to die for the nation. And not for the nation only, but in order that he might also gather together into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. So from that day on, they planned together to kill him. Now, what John intends, we're going to look at a quick overview of his gospel account. John states in chapter 20, verses 30 and 31, his intent, his goal for writing that book. He says, I could have written all kinds of things, but what I did write is intentional. And my goal, he says, but these have been written, the finished book, so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ. He means the one we are waiting for. He is also the Son of God. Now, we immediately tend to attach deity. That's important to us, but it may not have been that important to them, that he has a unique relationship with God. He is of God. And I think they think of it more broadly than we do. And that by believing, here's the point, you may have life. You may have life. He's offering life in his name, and that's his goal. And he's taking us on that journey. He's going to take us to that goal. And I'm going to make a quick what we have read thus far. The Gospel of John ramps up in chapter 1. The Word of God has become human flesh. The Word of God existed with God from the beginning, and the Word of God becomes flesh in verse 14 of chapter 1. As light will shine into the darkness, he says, and in him was life, and that life, or light, life, and that life was the light of men. So he's talking about light and life. And as light, the Word of God will shine into the darkness of the jungle. That's why we have that backdrop, the jungle. Jesus as the light is coming into the jungle, John chapter 1. The public ministry is John 2 through 11:53. This is where we are ending right now. The light moves about, as we've seen. John picks each of the stories, and the light shines into the darkness through his public ministry, beginning with Cana, the wedding, and he ends the public ministry with the raising of Lazarus. Darkness continues to push in. That's what we see. So we have light, we have darkness, light and darkness, and the darkness keeps pushing back. After demonstrating, now this is where we're going next, after demonstrating what life truly is, the light engages death itself, the full manifestation of darkness. We are boiling this down to some very simple terms. And we've looked at light and darkness, contrast. We've looked at life, now we look at death. And it's not four different ideas. Light corresponds to life, death corresponds to darkness. The full manifestation of darkness is death. And I've got references there. Notice my reference to Genesis chapters 3 and 4. Not because I pulled it out of a hat, it's because John starts his gospel in reference to the very beginning in Genesis, chapter 1, actually. The light itself enters the darkness. This is the passion. The light itself enters darkness itself, creating the way, and through that, he creates the way through human life for all humankind to be experienced, the all he's talking about in the here and now. And I think at sometimes Jesus attaches a future reality, which we're not removing from, but he's talking about life here and now. And I'm from John 17 through the end of the book is the actual passion and the actual passion itself. So there are four key terms in this whole thing. There's light, and contrast, there is darkness. And that's throughout the whole book. There is life and there is death, and that is throughout the whole book. And to think about the ramifications of what those mean is part of what John is talking about here in the book. So as we looked at this, here is this outline here, this little graph is leading us to John 20, 30 and 31 of the reason why he wrote the book. And that's how I've graphed it out. So let's take a look at how we have come to where we are in this study. And in order to do that, we go way back to John chapter 1, verses 1 through 13. And we were from week 2. Notice I pulled this from week 2. And because John starts with an echoing of Genesis chapter 1, in the beginning, God created. I went back there as well. and we looked at those first few chapters in Genesis as correlating to John chapter 1, verses 1 through 13. From the very beginning, in John 3, we talk about we call it the fall of mankind. I am calling it a dramatic separation. I've got a triangle representing of this common unity that the man and the woman and the Word of God experienced. And that what happened in John 3, this separation took place, and we can see it graphically what happened in the story. And then I transposed John 1, verses 1 through 13 on top of that. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. The Word is God. All things came into being through him, creation, and apart from him, not even one thing came into being that has come into being. That's the role of the Word. In him was life, and that life was the light of mankind. There's light and darkness, and the light shines to the darkness, and the darkness did not grasp it. I won't go into a lot of that right now about grasping it, but we know that there's a conflict between light and darkness, and that was from the beginning. A man came, one sent from God. His name was John the Baptist. He came as a witness to testify about this light so that all might believe through him. This is prior to the person of Jesus. He was not the light, but he came to testify about the light. The light is in the world at this time, but the light, the darkness is not grasping the light. Verse 6 and 7 and 8. This was the true light coming into the world, enlightens every man. He was in the world, the Word, and the world came into being through him, the Word, and yet the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own people did not accept him. But as many, he's talking about the Word, but as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God. There's that word again, child of God. To those who believe in his name, who were born not of blood, nor the will of the flesh, nor the will of man, but of God. That's the first 13 verses. And then it changes in verse 14, and the Word became flesh. That is where Jesus picks up. The Word, God has always, prior to the incarnation of Christ, has always been one who has been present through in this text, the Word. And people have come to believe, but primarily there has been an unbelief. And so with that idea, what we see is a darkness transposed over all creation. And there is what that illustrates right there. We then went on to Genesis 4, 1 through 5. And this is, in my book, my mind, Genesis 4, the story of Cain and Abel really illustrate what happens because of the fall in chapter 3. This is our human bent is illustrated in 4, 1 through 15. And this is what it looks like. And I remember coming up with this idea. I really like this idea. One of the few ideas. But here we have, this illustrates chapters 4, 1 through 15. We have separation here in Genesis. You know, I can't put my hand on my keypad because it goes south. And you can't really read that, but it says separation. And so what separation does is it causes in our relationships these two lines, and that is comparison. This is critical to the scapegoating process, this idea of comparison, and we see it right in the text right here, comparison. This is the story of Cain and Abel. There was a comparison going on. One animal sacrifice, one vegetable sacrifice, and it was a comparison. And it caused a distraughtness in Cain. And it eventually led to a, God says, hey, you don't have to be distraught. I forget the exact words, you don't have to be there, but he chose to be there. And there's resistance. There is a natural resistance within us human beings to humble ourselves under a grace that is present. And that is what I would attach to an evil. That's evil. When we've been given grace and we resist that. And then finally in the story, there's a dominance. When Cain kills his brother, that resistance is here, and then dominance would be right here, dominance. And Cain goes on. There's a temporary fulfillment. He scapegoats his brother. This is the first scapegoating story in the Bible right here. And so we had the three words, comparison, resistance, and dominant. This is from week 3. And I believe these are the three propensities of human nature that have acted out over and over and has all kinds of different ways to do it. And I came up with 3 symbols back in week 3. Comparison are 2 lines that look like this, that it's part of our nature. And I think John is writing about this. We tend to look to others to know what we want. We're not independent people. We're not independent thinkers. We desire that because somebody else wants that. And that has a number of different faces. And it creates conflict. This whole idea that it's in us to compare. And it causes conflict. Which is seen in resistance, where there's a butting of the heads, and that one takes the dominant role to scapegoat the other. And there's where dominance comes in. And so what we did way back, and I had no idea this was all going to happen like this, but I built this background in the slides. It's every slide has this background of the 3 propensities over and over and over again of comparison, resistance, dominance. And I transposed a shaded area on top, and we're calling that the jungle. That is the context where the word enters in chapter 1 and verse 14. The word is entering this jungle, which was true then, and it's certainly true now. We also transpose 2 other symbols within our backdrop. From week 11 is where John the Baptist, out of verses 19 through 28. And what I'm doing here is just showing you the back where we've come and how we built this image that every slide is on, and it's symbolic of what the book is about. The person of Jesus is the benchmark. Right here, that you know what that is. That's a benchmark. Probably everybody has seen that location right there. There is no other. It's interesting that prior to the incarnation, the benchmark was still there in the person of the Word of God. But since the incarnation took place, Jesus is the benchmark. He is the very basis and beginning of all things, and that won't change. That never has changed or retained. And so every slide has that idea that we're looking at the incarnation. The symbol reminds us of what I call the objective reality. That means, let me back up for a minute. I've become more and more, I believe Jesus died for my sin and your sin. I believe that. I believe something happened on the cross that dramatically changed virtually everything. However, in my journey, I have become more and more aware of the person of Jesus and his example of how to live life. Now, within that context, one can go into a self-improvement mode that, oh, we just need to get better. My belief is I can't get better. I'm in a human condition, and I can't do this by myself. The objective truth is that Jesus died for us on the cross, and whatever that means, we're looking at least through John's perspective. And through that, something objective happened that allows me to live a different life. Jesus talks about that when he talks about the release of the Holy Spirit, the presence of Jesus. And I believe that is that is apparent. So this marker here shows the objective truth that he is the one. He is the one that everything is built upon. However, and from week 12, we looked at yet the last symbol. I'm moving pretty quick because I want to get to table time. The last symbol in our every slide we have has all this component in it, and it's a cairn, it's a marker. And that through, if you picture these cairn, if you've ever been out walking and you're in a real rocky area, you can look ahead and somebody's gone before you and they've marked the path that isn't a path, it's just stone, and you can see where you're supposed to go. And here in this aspect, Jesus is the subjective, the subjective. He's showing us how to live life in freedom, free from bondage primarily from ourselves. And on a day-by-day basis, this marker, these cairns are showing us as we're moving away from the benchmark. The benchmark is always true, but we're moving about in life and we're looking at the person of Jesus in a subjective way, that his example is true, and it's inviting me to follow. One more quick, we then, and I'm going to bypass this. We then, from week 25, we looked at the wedding at Cana, chapter 2, and we saw how Jesus's interaction at the wedding at Cana fit right into this whole idea, followed by his time in the temple, where he had where he turned over the money changers. Those two together in contrast. One shows the lavishness, provision through Christ of how it's intended to be. The other one shows how humankind has taken something wonderful and turned it into a prescribed religious system that falls short of what is actually true. So in summary, here's the last slide. Summary, John writes his gospel account during the end of the first century. We know that. It's one of the last books. He does so in order to inform the newly formed church, first century, how to think about Jesus. His emphasis is that all people groups would come together into oneness. John 17, he says that. We'll look at that in detail. The world is existing in a state of what we've termed the jungle. This is the world that we live in. God has acted through the person of Jesus to bring about a restorative means by which the madness demonstrated within the jungle can be stopped. That is what I think John is writing about, that this can be stopped through what he has done on the cross. We have examined Jesus as he has interacted with numerous individuals in his public ministry in groups, inviting them to believe in him. In doing so, he promises a new and rewarding type of life to be experienced again in the here and now. His public ministry culminates with the raising of Lazarus from the dead, which is right where we're at. We would think that this miracle would be the definitive proof of his message, resulting in, oh man, Jesus, we knew it all along. Now you proved it. It just didn't happen that way. It just didn't happen. They all didn't. At the raising of a man from the dead, the pushback got bigger. This is not the case that everyone came to faith. And we plan to examine this pivotal text from within this context of what I just summarized here. Now, table time. A resurrection has occurred. That's where we end with Lazarus. The pushback is not relieved. That's truth. In fact, the tension extrapolates. There's even more and more resistance, as we've seen in the slide. It's here the decision is made that Jesus must die. And it is it's the believing community who plan to kill him. It's the believing community who plan to kill him. That's tragic, profoundly tragic, but it's also profoundly up to date within every culture, including right here and right now. It's the same story over and over. As you and I observe from the wider perspective, we kind of zoom out here for a minute. We see conflicts in all shapes, forms, societal and personal, contrast. It's everywhere. What humans do to humans is tragic. And I think that is the core of what he's talking about here. Just a side note quickly, I was looking at Genesis 6 when I was doing this study in preparation. And in Genesis 6, the story of Noah, where it says, and because of the wickedness of all of the peoples. And I go, well, what does wicked mean? Because you think of all kinds of sins, all kinds of sexual sin, non-sexual sins, and all types of things you see in the Ten Commandments. It's primarily the idea of violence. The wickedness they're talking about is about violence, and it's later in that same chapter that Noah wickedness is tied to violence. It's what John is talking about is the atrocities that humankind does to humankind. And that's what he's talking about. It is this need to place blame we humans have employed throughout history to settle matters in order to restore a temporary harmony. That is the core idea of the scapegoating practice. John has directed his audience attention to this matter here in 49 through 53. He brings everything to this point, and then he's going to move on to the passion from this point on. And I think that is really important. And his intent is that all who listen may have a new kind of life right here and right now. So I move very quickly. It's 7:45. And here I just pause and I say, fellas, this is a mouthful. I've had weeks to think about this. And so it's really not fair for, because you guys are just kind of being brought into this idea. But at this juncture, I'd like to end these last 50 minutes or so. Right now, I'm sure you've got questions, you've got concerns, you've got hopes, you've got fears. We have all been taught a certain way. I'm not trying to teach something new, but I'm coming from what John, the writer, at least from my perspective, what he's trying to impart. So what are your thoughts in regard to how we're trying to understand John's message here? What are your thoughts here in the last 15 minutes or so? That's a mouthful.
Yeah. I
That's a lot.
had a lot of them, but what I was thinking about is every so often there's this agency that goes through now with DNA evidence and just finding people who have been locked up in prison unfairly or unjustly. If you go back to the trial, there's just this public outcry to find the perpetrator, and they don't have one. So they create one and throw someone in jail.
So that is an example of the scapegoating process.
Yeah, it's problem solved. We found him, he's in jail, but he was innocent, That's tragic.
I'm sure that's happened more than once.
Oh, geez, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And usually to a minority.
Yeah. Boy, the real challenge, and I'm going to share this in a couple of weeks, is making the correlation between what's happening out there in society and how I personally think. And I'm going to share a personal story. Again, I don't think we want to beat ourselves up over this, but I think that it is, according to John, not a problem, but I think it's the thing he's writing about right here. We certainly see it in the text. Any other ideas, thoughts? Question, John, you're the big questioner.
So Mike, last week you mentioned that Jesus was fully human. So how does that, and this week you're talking about the model that he has been the model for us, how to live. So I didn't know if you wanted to expand more on the fully human part, but I guess my question would be how's this working for us? How's this working for you? I mean, here we are thus far in our journeys, right?
Right, yeah.
So how, if you had to say, how's it working? Do you feel like it's working?
Well, I don't really know, and you've directed that to me, right? Do you want to?
Well, yeah, I'll start with you.
Yeah. I know this, that I've become more and more enamored by the person of Jesus. And I do believe he's demonstrating, I think there is a general bindedness of us humans that we, by our own self-created constructs. And I will say this, as I've gotten older here, I'm becoming more and more aware of that happening inside of me. Not that I'm getting any better. Well, I think there's some improvement, but I'm much slower to speak on, I'm much, just not so fast, kind of thinking. I'm becoming more aware of my own biases and the ways I think and my own tendencies to scapegoat people that are outside of my box. Those things, those things I'm becoming more, how it's working, I haven't really, I'll get back to you on that one. I don't know. But I think it does lead to freedom. You know, to be able to stand toe to toe with someone and admit I'm wrong and ask for forgiveness and apology is not as difficult as it used to be. Because I don't know.
I think, John, as you were asking, the personal perspective of who Jesus is to me has definitely changed from my youth to today. Because there was a time I became aware that I was a sinner, and that I was told and taught that a price needs to be paid for these sins that you did, Vince. You went against God's rules, and somebody's got to pay the price for this, and you're the guy. And
Yeah.
it was overwhelming to me. It was, how could I possibly pay the price for this? I'm sinning even as we speak. This is never going to stop. And when it was brought to my attention that Jesus Christ paid the price in my stead, it was a great relief to me. But in my youthful foolishness, I just thought it was over. Well, glad that's done. I can get on with my life now. And it never occurred to me that the example that Jesus gave the world was one of what a human is supposed to be like. It wasn't just singularly a payment for my mistakes, a payment for my sin. It was an example of what life should look like. And it wasn't until later, much later in my life, that I realized that there's more to Jesus' ministry than just paying for my sins. It was an example of what humankind is supposed to look like. And so that put on me, am I looking like Jesus at all? Am I doing anything that he did? Am I emulating his actions, his thoughts at all? Am I a follower of Jesus? Am I really following? Or am I just thankful that I don't have to die? And it's a big evolution, big change in the way I look at God.
Vince, you have said that very well. Thank you very much. I do have a question for you, and this isn't by any way a test by any means, but I was thinking about this idea in relation to the big thrust a few years ago where everybody get a bracelet. What would Jesus do? And how is that different, or is it different in your mind in regard to following? In one way, that is to say, okay, what would Jesus do? I wear a bracelet. I want to do what Jesus does. Well, of course, but somehow it doesn't hold the weight of how I feel and how what I'm talking about. And I'd like to know how you feel about that.
You're asking me. I mean, I remember reading the book. There was a whole book on that, that everyone in a town vowed to not do anything until they asked the question of what would Jesus do, and I'll just do that. And they found it very difficult. They found it very remarkable that it's not easy to do. Because at some point in your life, if you're a merchant or a storekeeper or something, it's a great idea in Sunday school. Let's only do what Jesus would do. But then eventually you get around to tax time. It's April and you got to fill out your income tax, and you're answering the questions and you go, I don't think this is going to work. If I do what I think Jesus would do, I would be honest. I can't be honest. I'll lose my shit. Right. I mean, this is ridiculous.
They can afford it better than I can.
Well, and that's where the rationale comes in, and you start to realize this Jesus is quite a remarkable man, and that even though he's the goal, the example puts you on the thoughts of, let every thought be captive to the obedience of Christ. It's hard to do. It's just very hard to do, but it's a journey that I think needs to be taken, whether you're successful or not.
Yeah.
I-
Bill,
Yeah, it's contextual. If people go, what would Jesus do? Well, he would, Archbishop Krill, the Russian Orthodox Church, says, well, he would invade the country and drive the evildoers out. I mean, it can become very contentious on your interpretation.
oh, yeah. So
Yeah, but
what
I
Jesus would do is not necessarily what Jesus would do.
would do. Yeah,
It depends
I
on
found
who's saying that. That's a good point. Yeah.
and what I found out, and this doesn't answer all the questions, but it helps me, is I rephrase the question to how would Jesus do it? Because most of the scripture isn't the what, because cultures and things change over time. Things are happening now you couldn't answer what back then.
Yeah.
But how you do it is pretty consistent it's a character issue over time. And how you do it, how you behave, your character, that can be consistent. More better than figuring out exactly how to solve the problem.
Yeah, that's a good stab at that, Bill. Thank you. It's a different deal.
Yeah.
Yeah. Other thoughts?
I think a fair amount of this conversation also incorporates the discussion. I know that John White and I have discussed this a little bit, and I've discussed it with other people, and it can be presented in kind of that's not a very significant or quote unquote deep question. And it's the question, is our journey about a destination, or is our journey about the journey? And I think too often, sorry about that. Too often, we're so focused on being where we want to be, that destination, but we don't stop to think about, consider, discuss with one another what steps we need to take to get there. If you're taking a trip, this is a simple analogy. If you're going to take a driving trip somewhere, you know what your destination is, and you know that's where you want to get. But you have to do a couple of things and do them right, or you won't get there. Well, because Jesus died for us, our destination is secure. So we make an illogical flip. Some of us, it says, since my destination is secure, it doesn't matter what I do. And that's where the focus on the destination becomes the problem, because I believe our faith is a journey. Mike, I think that's what you've been describing.
Yeah.
The journey more recently has become a real revelatory, a real changing, a real experiential part of life. And it's because, yes, you believe that your destination is secure, but you're also understanding that's, and it sounds so funny, that isn't all there is to it.
No.
It just isn't all there is to it. So
No. That's
Someone
another great comment. It really ties in with what Vince said. Thank you, Dave.
There's a comment about, there's a turn around the nice when they did the Apostles' Creed. You go through, it's very lengthy, and it comes to the point, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered in Pontius Pilate, dead and buried. And someone said, excuse me, you just skipped over the 4 Gospels and everything that's included in them. And it was sort of reflected of the time of proper thinking versus proper behavior.
Yeah.
my cuckoo clock says I've got to get ready to go to my next appointment. So
Okay. Thank you for coming. We won't meet next week, but we'll pick up on the 4th of January. And thanks for joining in, Dave.
See you, Dave.
Yeah. See you, Dave. Bye now.
Hey, Steve, what are you thinking?
I like Bill's question. How would Jesus do things? What a great Christmas question. Mike, you said right at the beginning, we're working to understand how to think about Jesus.
Yeah.
And I just think, what a what great prompts right now at Christmas time.
Yeah.
What better thing to do than to ponder the incarnation and what it should mean for us and how we live.
Yeah.
I guess that's where I'm just sort of flat-footed when I think about this, because there's so much mystery here.
Yeah.
Goes with the article that you sent to us, John. We're looking at the face of God, so to speak, here when we think about the incarnation and Jesus coming. It's a good message to ponder.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, thanks, Steve. That's really true. Yeah.
Hey, Bob, don't want to let you off the hook either. So any thoughts here?
I think, we touched it. All this discussion touches on it. How do you close that gap? And I'm aware that over the last few years, the idea of understanding agape love, the love of Christ, becomes so much more important and a challenge. Praying for our enemies.
Yeah. That's a big
All of those kind of things that we're taught, and Jesus articulates it to us, but we slide right over it and slide right by it. And I think that's the answer. It is bringing the love of Christ into our everyday life and everyday relationship, even with people that don't look like us.
Yeah.
Even with people we may have scapegoated unfairly, which would call an enemy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Tatsi, real quick.
John, I get such a kick out of you.
Oh, yeah. Well, we're done, but we got to hear from Tatsi too.
Yeah, we got to hear from Tatsi.
John's the enforcer.
Unmute thyself, Tatsi.
That's funny.
Nazi's muted.
Oh, you must be muted, Tatsi.
Yes, still muted. Oh,
There you go.
So anyway, I was just thinking about Bill's comment about how, and and I agree with that. But the problem with me is when I think about how, I start getting into the works mentality. Okay, so for me, at least, to stay out of that mentality, I have to go back to the basic thing about when I came to Christ, which is I die and then I raise it again into Christ, in terms of I need to die to my old life and sins kind of thing. And so that's how I have to deal with the works, is to go back to my basic faith that I came to in the beginning, which I always call the leap of faith kind of a thing. And so that's the conflict I have in terms of, dealing with what would Jesus do and how you do it kind of a thing that Bill's expressing. Is it kind of sometimes leads me back into my works mentality, which from my past background of being Japanese and being American, of that mentality of works is what you need to do. That's what I was preached to when I was growing up a lot, in terms of you work hard, you do this and that kind of thing, and then you'll be successful. So anyway, that's my thought on it.
I had to lay down the works as a red herring, because the how is really defined. It's not achieving a work. There's no works we achieve, but it's character. We may fail miserably, but how did we fail? In other words, the ends never justifies the means. I have come to that, and too bad we abandoned that in some of the latest political battles. You do it right, and if you fail, you fail. If you succeed, that's up to God. But how you live your life is really critical. Not for heaven, but just for reflecting God.
Yeah, amen to that. So Tatsi, would you say you die daily then, or you just died once a long time ago?
I have to more or less do it daily. To be honest about it.
Yeah, well,
Wow. Forgiveness eliminates that little diagram on Mike's where it says resistance. If you're forgiving, that resistance disappears.
It's amazing.
I didn't want to get into it, but
That's amazing.
what's happened in this last week to one of my wife's best friend's daughter, her grandson, and it made national news actually, is he shot and killed his mom. My best friend's, one of my wife's best friend's daughter. It was kind of her lifeline or whatever. And then he called the cops actually. He shot her 7 times and she didn't die immediately. She died on the ambulance ride to the hospital. But he was ready to go in there and blow apart the neighbor and all of their kids and whatever kind of a thing. But fortunately, he called the cops and they got there right away. And so, they did that. But I just thought about this mentality where we're reading about people going out and killing other people kind of a thing.
Right.
And what struck me was Mike pointing out that during the time of Noah, the principal sin was violence. And this is what's actually happening to our society nowadays.
That was
So-
eye-opening to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I'm just pondering about how has our society kind of degraded, American society degraded to the point to where, in the old days, whatever, the biggest thing that would happen is somebody kills themselves, or when I grew up, somebody did kill their parents. But now it seems to be that it's just a common occurrence. That people are, they
angry.
talk about suicide by cop kind of a thing, but
Yeah.
now it's like suicide by mass killing. So
Yeah.
I don't know how our society has degraded to that point.
Yeah.
We certainly have the capacity now to do it that wasn't quite as accessible before.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's a
sobering.
that's a tragic story, Tati, and I'm really sorry you guys are going through all that and what's going on with your wife and all that.
Yeah.
To turn it around, not to deny that by any means, but this is Christmas week, and we do have an amazing hope in and through Christ. Everyone has talked about living life now. Steve gave us a really nice overview of what this week represents and the person of Jesus and the incarnation, and what does that mean for me and you is a great question. And we'll pick that. There's my transition. We're going to quit now. And we'll pick that up next time, January 4th. We'll meet and we'll continue on with that. So have a Merry Christmas, all of you,
Christmas.
and enjoy your relationships, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank
Yep.
you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you guys.
You bet.